Water hard, tea better. Yes, tea is better. The question is, how do you expand a short story into a full story concept-wise at least? Okay, I had soup yesterday. Wonderful. That is awesome. Let's do this. Somebody give me a concept for a short story. Someone, anyone. Let's start there. Someone ad-lib. The moon is actually a giant egg. Okay, there we go. The moon is a giant egg. And how does somebody interact with this information? Or is this about the moment somebody discovers that the moon is a giant egg? Okay, let's do that. So this short story is the astronauts during the moon landing discover that moon is a giant egg. All right. The astronauts during the moon landing, discover the moon is a giant egg. Okay. A short story by its nature. And when I'm talking short story here, as you know, from those of you who have attended my condensed workshop, a short story, especially a piece of flash fiction, is one single moment in time or one kind of shift in a character's knowledge or a belief system. Cosmic omelet. The moon is leaking. Oh my gosh, the moon is leaking. Okay, this is good. I'm going to write down the first thing the astronauts during the moon landing discover: the moon is a giant egg. How do we expand on that? Let's get some ideas here. We have, there is a crack in the moon, and they were trying to colonize, and the moon is leaking. Moon trembles. So our original short story was that moment that Beale Barmstrong descended in his lunar capsule and first planted feet on the moon and discovered that it was, in fact, a giant egg. Or maybe it wasn't until they brought back some of the space rock and realized that it was actually the shell around an egg back on Earth. Like maybe that's when they discovered that the moon was an egg. But moon jelly, yes. But somehow, maybe it, hey, if it's more of like a reptilian egg, then it could be softer and more squishy than if it was, say, an avian egg, which tends to have a harder shell. So maybe the moon is hatching. So we have this concept of the short story about that moment that the astronaut first realized, oh my god, the moon is an egg. Well, that's the one moment. That's the instigating incident, you could say. But what does it mean? We have that initial shock. We have that initial moment, that initial emotion, that initial whoa, boom. Here we go. The moon is an egg. Well, what happens next? Maybe there's a crack in the moon. Maybe the moon is starting to tremble. And so then we go from the astronauts discovering the moon is a giant egg to a crack opens up in the moon and it starts to leak. Scientists on Earth scramble. Pun absolutely intended. Now all of a sudden we've got more than one character. We've got a scientist character, a potentially more than one scientist character. We've got the astronaut character, or more than one astronaut characters. So now we have the interplay of different characters who could have potentially different emotional and plot-based storylines to complete their arc. Alien life. The moon is starting to hatch, and they have to deal with a slash plan for hatching. No moon equals no tides, and no cosmic protection from the asteroids. Also, the eggshells flying out to the Earth. There's a lot that could happen. And also, too, what kind of creature is in the moon? Is there a creature in the moon? all of these things all of a sudden are opening up that basic concept, that 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 word story about an astronaut landing on the moon and realizing that it's actually an egg. That realization that the moon is actually an egg is the end of that story. That is the whole thing of that short story. To pull that concept apart, all of a sudden now we're adding what happens next. What happens now? What are the ramifications of the moon being an egg? Well, what happens when it hatches? What's it going to hatch into? Is it going to hatch into, like some people believe, maybe you have a reporter character, or you have the family member of one of the astronauts is surrounded by people who all of a sudden start thinking that the moon is actually going to hatch into a planet-eating monster. Chaos ensues. So now you've got a potential planet-eating monster. You've got the scientists and the officials that are trying to figure out what to do about it. You have the astronauts on the moon, and you've got the plucky viewpoint character that we're going to need in order to kind of make sense of the world as it is. It's a wormhole. It hatches, revealing it's not a creature coming out. 'Tis a hollow world, and the inner world's evolved to space travel. Ooh, hey, there you go. That could be it. And then all of a sudden now you have like 3 or 4 different storylines that you can rely on to build the story out from that point to that full novel concept point. And then at some point you start trying to converge them. So you have 4 storylines that are potentially, they seem like they're independent of each other. And then you find out over time that they actually converge. A really good author who does this quite a bit is William Gibson. William Gibson, my favorite author of all time. He does this a lot, especially in his earlier work. My favorite book, my favorite novel in the history of the world was Count Zero by William Gibson. It's the last of the Sprawl trilogy, the last of like Neuromancer, Mona Lisa, Overdrive, and Count Zero. And you go through the majority of the book thinking that all of these people are leading separate lives in separate places, and then you start finding them conjoining. And then once those storylines conjoin, then they can have their big moment, and then they can either conclude or finish up in such a way that they're building on to the next novel if it's a series. But if it's a standalone novel, then you have these storylines kind of going places, you have them growing, you have them expanding. You travel down that road of figuring out, what does this plucky 19-year-old rock musician do with a whole bunch of people around her who think that the moon is going to, turn into a giant planet-eating monster, and you have, all that kind of stuff, and what she's going to do about it, how she's going to stop people from panicking, or stops, some organization from trying to steal nuclear warheads to destroy the moon before it could happen, because they've got to save themselves. Like, you have all those kind of things, and maybe by that point in that novel, the rock star ends up joining up with the, governmental scientist who's trying to get people to calm down, or trying to figure out something else and what to do about it, and then they end up concluding both of their storylines at the same time within this novel. So now you've got something that could spread to 90 to 100,000 words. And all it comes from is that, 1,000 to 2,000 word story of an astronaut lands on the moon and realizes that when he goes to take a sample of the moon rock, he cracks open a giant egg. And it starts off as just a little fissure, and then it rumbles and cracks more, and all of a sudden they start realizing that the moon is an egg. What if the moon isn't hatching but is unfertilized or maybe dead? Lots of different things to do. Moon could be dying and crumble apart. Yeah, and on the easy, give us something hard. Yeah. On the flip of that, what happens if, hey, Wolfkeeper, how's it going? What happens if the moon does hatch and becomes this dragon-like monster that is actually the protector of the world and likes to trail circles around the planet just like the moon did? And so instead of just this circle in the sky, all of a sudden you look up and you could see the dragon there. Ouroboros Jr. It could be a solar omelet. Yeah, it could be the space dragon. Maybe somebody decides to try and hooked a bunch of nukes up there to cook it. Like, well, if we cook it, then it'll stay there. And then it'll do what it needs to do. But then, of course, you have to defeat that, and then boom, all of a sudden, the moon is a dragon. And it grows to an appropriate size, and it protects the world, and then the planet doesn't ever have to worry about meteor showers or asteroids because the dragon is there. Nukes just make it grow. That sounds cool, right? Like, so what we're doing, Wolfkeeper, Daz asked a question of how do you take a short story and turn it into a full novel-sized concept? Moon would like yummy radiation. It has no atmosphere after all. And so I was like, okay, what, let's prompt it out. What's our prompt? And I think it was Dupe who was like, oh yeah, the moon's an egg. Okay, let's go with it. Let's see how we can change that from a single short story idea to a novel. It eats raw sun UV. Think of all that stuff that you get from a short story where an astronaut takes a pickaxe, or insert instrument here, cracks open a rock on the moon and discovers that he's cracked open an egg. Does that help? Because you're expanding, what does that mean? What are the bigger ramifications of it? You're also expanding out different characters and adding different character arcs. You're adding arcs that you can follow through on and then find a way to complete by the end of it. And again, it's that question of how to make a cup of coffee. It's when you think about it, making a cup of coffee is a process that takes multiple different routes in order to accomplish. The end result is you make a cup of coffee. But when you're taking something like a short story and you're looking at that cup and you're like, okay, how did I make this? Then you can find those trailing bits where you can connect the dots. And it's like, well, then somebody had to grow this coffee bean. Okay, well, this person's name is Stanford, and Stanford lives in Zebedee, and Stanford in Zebedee is a co-op farmer, and you know what? He's going to have to deal with, I don't know, an insect. Yes, okay, so there's this insect, plague that's sweeping through Zebedee, and Stanford has to find a way to save his farm so that the coffee harvest can actually go through, so he can make enough money to do X, Y, and Z, or so that that person named Lou could be holding on to a cup of coffee in a completely different place on that same world, but you're finding those other people, because nothing happens in a vacuum. Pickaxes aren't damaged by solar flares. Yeah, there you go. Okay, here, let's see. Honestly, I need to come up a short story. Oh, okay. I would hope astronauts would have something more sophisticated than a pickaxe. I mean, then again, if it works. Yes, it helps very much. Okay, good. Onino Kingly says leave it on the slow burner for a bit and see if it expands, or ask a bunch of expanding questions and see if it sticks. What's the end goal? Ending first is a good way to approach. Pickaxes aren't damaged by solar flares. True. I imagine swinging it in a spacesuit would be difficult. Several insect pests have been reported in coffee, the most important being the coffee leaf miner, the coffee berry borer, and the coffee stem borer. It's like, you see, like, again, a short story is a photograph. It is a moment in time. A short story is a single moment wrapped around a character or a decision, something which has changed. That's what a short story is. Something has changed. Or somebody has decided to rebel against change. But there is some form of movement there. There is some form of moment. There is some form of movement. Something has been given or building up for a while. or it's continuing to build, but we don't have a rectification. But usually there is some form of rectification in a short story, um, unless the idea of waiting for Godot is the whole point. Unless, kind of that theater of the absurd idea that nothing really matters, we're going to be constantly waiting for Godot. Um, a novel is taking that initial nest egg and expanding, how did we get here? Or what do we do now that we're here? Can we just leave a note for Godot and go to the library? Really? But yeah, so you can take that short story that you made and you lovingly crafted and everything else. You can take that single moment in time, that single concept that you're working on, and you're either expanding up to the point of how you got there, or you're seeing what happens now that you're there. And you can lengthen it out. You can add more characters. You can add more of the background information. You can build the world more. You can spend that time seeing what the fallout is going to be from the decision that Caleb makes right before Son of Abel, where he decides that even if it kills him, he's leaving the truce. And that's where Char and Ash is coming in. That end point of Char and Ash was enough stuff happens, Caleb gives up. Um, and I had to build all the stuff that happened to get him to that point where he's, after 160 years, he's done. He can't do anymore. He's done. And then, of course, we see in Son of Abel that, you know, spoilers for when that comes out, that re comes out, I should say.